Yep.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Technoscience Thursday at 2 webinar series. Um, my name is Julie Hinderer. I'm with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Just briefly wanted to introduce the webinar series. So we're we're hosting about 6 monthly webinars during 2025. This is our fourth webinar. They're always on Thursdays at 2 p.m. And we post the recordings on YouTube at Lamprey Control. And Jake is dropping some links in the chat to our webinar series webpage and our YouTube channel. And essentially, the goal of this webinar series is to bring cutting edge technologies in front of fishery managers, management agency staff, and scientists. To just kind of bring people up to speed on technology and talk about how it might be applied in fishery management. And the next webinar is going to be 26th of June, and that's going to feature live sonar issues and opportunities associated with that. I'm really excited for this webinar. We're going to have a presentation from Steve Cook, sort of introducing the technology and some potential opportunities for use in management and research, and also some potential challenges. And then we have a panel of practitioners, including fishery managers from the Illinois DNR and the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries and Parks, and also the conservation director from Bassmaster Tournaments, who are going to talk about this technology. So I think this will be a really cool discussion. We don't have this up on the webinar webpage yet, but we do have the registration link for the webinar. So Jake will be dropping that in the chat as well. So do register for that when you get a minute. And then before I introduce our first speaker, just some quick Zoom tips. Please mute your audio when you're not speaking. And then during our question and answer periods after each presentation, you can either drop your questions or comments in the chat, and we will be monitoring that. Or you can click on this React icon at the bottom, and the raise hand function is in that menu, and you can raise your hand there and someone will call on you for your question. So thanks for being here. I'm going to stop sharing and introduce our first speaker. So Dr. Tom Binder is director of the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System, or GLaDOS, at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. He's going to start us off today with a little intro on what GLaDOS is. So take it away, Tom.
Are you guys seeing the screen now?
Looks good.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction, Julie. Yeah, so I guess I'm the opening act here. My job today is to kind of set the stage for the two talks that are going to follow here, just by providing a brief introduction about acoustic telemetry and the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System. So most of you are probably somewhat familiar with acoustic telemetry, but for anyone who isn't, I like to think of acoustic telemetry as kind of a high-tech mark recapture tool. It's comprised of two primary components: the transmitter, which is the mark, and that's an electronic tag that's attached to the fish, and it transmits a unique series of pings that identifies a specific individual. And then the second component is a receiver, and this is the capture method. And these devices listen for, decode, and log transmissions. And then when it detects a tag, it adds a timestamp, so you get a time series of detections of your individual fish. And acoustic telemetry differs from traditional mark recapture in a few ways that are advantageous to fisheries scientists. The first is that you tend to get a higher rate of recapture, and that's because the tags transmit over longer distances. So there's a higher likelihood of the receivers intercepting those signals than, say, a net intercepting a fish. You also tend to get multiple recaptures or detections per individual, as opposed to traditional methods where you usually only know the start point and then one or two recaptures at most. And then because these receivers or listening devices are autonomous, they have batteries that and can listen, be out all year round. you tend to have a better ability to sample more consistently over space and time. So there are two basic categories of acoustic telemetry that's being applied in the Great Lakes currently. The first is called presence-absence telemetry. Here you have kind of a solitary receiver, either stationary or mobile. And when that receiver detects a transmitter, you know that tag was somewhere within the detection radius of the receiver. Um, and for analyses, typically the location of receiver is assumed to be the position of the fish at time of detection. So you can imagine that kind of telemetry is typically used for looking at broad scale movements and habitat use specifically because detection ranges can be fairly long depending on transmitter specs and environmental conditions. But to give you a sense of the kind of information you can collect, I just chose a track from a single lake trout that was tagged during the spawning seasons in Thunder Bay and Lake Huron here. The red dots show the positions or interpolated positions, and the black dots are receivers. And you'll see as the time series progresses here, you'll see more and more receivers going into Lake Huron as recently it became fully covered. So just play this here. So you can see the fish started in Thunder Bay, moved up into the North Channel area, came back down, moved into the kind of central Lake Huron back to Thunder Bay. So you can see you get a lot more detailed information about where this fish went. You can see that this fish actually made extensive movements in the lake, and this is much different than you would expect to see if you use traditional methods, where all you're going to get is that first location and then maybe one location along that track. So you may get very different answers depending on these two different technologies. The second major category of telemetry used in the Great Lakes is the so-called fine-scale positional telemetry. With this kind of telemetry, you have a densely oriented array with receivers that have overlapping detection ranges. And the way the system works is that when you have a transmission that's heard on three or more receivers at the same time, you can use the difference in the time it takes for that transmission to get to each of the receivers in order to calculate the exact location of the fish. And usually you get a location that's accurate to 10 meters or less. So this kind of telemetry is typically used more for fine scale applications, looking at fine scale movements and habitat use. This is another example of lake trout in northern Lake Huron on the south shore of Drummond Island. This study specifically was comparing the spawning habitat use of wild and hatchery lake trout. On the left-hand side, you can see there the receiver net array. And sorry, there's a chainsaw going in the background. I'm a little distracted. Anyway, the receiver array covered an area of about 25 square kilometers and was comprised of about 135 receivers. So this is a very densely packed array. On the right-hand side, you can see a heat map of the position densities showing areas of congregation of the fish, which identified in this area 6 distinct spawning locations. So you get very fine-scaled information about where the fish are, and then you can try to correlate that to environmental characteristics and such. So use of acoustic telemetry in the Great Lakes has really grown exponentially over the last 15 years. And acoustic telemetry studies tend to fit into kind of three main categories. You've got studies on population dynamics, looking at like stock contributions, survival estimations, and testing assumptions of assessment models. You've got your behavior studies, looking at migratory patterns, habitat use, and spawning behaviors. And then you've got more ecological studies looking at species interactions and environmental interactions. So as the use of acoustic telemetry in the Great Lakes has increased, it's really become clear that coordination among researchers is vitally important to ensuring the success of these independent acoustic telemetry projects. So in 2010, the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System was formed. And GLaDOS, as it's known, is a multinational network of researchers who collaboratively use telemetry to understand fish behavior and address important management needs. And the GLaDOS network currently has 371 members, 215 of which have active ongoing projects in the lake. And those 215 members with active projects come from 62 different organizations. So we really have a lot of participation in the GLaDOS network, and a lot of groups using this technology to study fish behavior. So programmatically, GLaDOS is a special project within the Science Directorate at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. It's administered by the Commission in partnership with Michigan State University and the U.S. Geological Survey. And GLaDOS services the Great Lakes community in several ways. Our primary mission is coordination, and we do this through an annual workshop that we put on, and here we provide researchers with opportunities to interact with one another. We put on training workshops, and researchers are encouraged to share the results. We also maintain a website that has a map of current and past receiver deployments, as well as project pages that allow researchers to connect with one another. And then we help to coordinate receiver tending among groups and liaise with resource managers. The second category of services that we provide are data services. Most important of those are the maintenance of a network wide detection database, which we use to allow researchers to share detections among each other. Those detections are provided in a standard format that allows you to combine data sets and also to import your data into kind of standard statistical packages, such as the R package that's also maintained by our group. GLaDOS also has technical assistance, primarily in the form of training, things like receiver tending and tagging, but we also have consultation services for study design and data analysis. GLaDOS does have an active research program. Our researchers do a combination of hypothesis-driven research and R&D, with the R&D focus primarily on telemetry methods, things like mooring designs and tagging methods, as well as methods for anesthesia or immobilization. And then lastly, GLaDOS has an equipment loan program, which helps offset some of the costs of conducting these types of projects. Primarily, we're loaning out receivers and hydrophones, but we do have a small selection of dummy tags, as well as an ultrasound and various mooring gears. So as I mentioned, GLaDOS has grown exponentially over the last 15 years, and this is just a map showing the current status of the receiver network. As you can see, the network is extensive, covers a lot of the lake, and specifically, there are full lake arrays in Lake Ontario, Erie, and Huron. And the large data sets that are coming from this network really allow us to inform management questions that previously were either difficult or impossible to address. And so that's where I'll kind of end my introduction here. The next pair of talks are going to focus on the application of the acoustic telemetry to address management needs. And specifically, you're going to see how large and detailed telemetry data sets can be used to quantify space use and habitat selection at very broad scales. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. So if anyone has like one or two quick questions while Silvia's pulling up her slides, we have just a minute or two for that. Anything for Tom? You can also, Tom will, all of our speakers will be available at the end for questions as well. Okay, seeing none, our next speaker is Dr. Silviya Ivanova. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Windsor School of the Environment. Go ahead, Silviya. Looks good. You're on mute. Okay.
Yeah, I was just looking where the unmute button went. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Thank you for the introduction, Julie, and thanks for inviting me to speak here today. I will go over very briefly, in a way, about the areas of ecological significance and how we use novel machine learning methods and leverage the data from GLaDOS to actually quantify these areas. Um, just quickly, I want to acknowledge before I begin talking about the project that we did. This has spanned over 10 years of tagging, and it involves multiples of institutions and researchers that have been involved in tagging this fish in Lake Ontario. There's a lot of funding agencies and institutions that have been involved and people, so I just wanted to acknowledge them very quickly. So to begin, I guess, what are areas of ecological significance? Generally, they're known as regions or habitats that provide critical resources to one or more species or populations, comparing to other regions, either in the same ecosystem or across other ecosystems as well. So details of these areas can be very useful for decision makers and provide information that is needed, for example, to prioritize and implement actions, for example, for conservation areas, for restoring habitats, or even managing fisheries. So when we use novel modeling approaches such as machine learning to quantify EASs, it can actually help us quantify environmental conditions, and the models can be used for hindcasting or forecasting in order to inform responses to species productions or behavioral responses in terms of future predictions. So, for example, to climate change as environmental conditions change and water is warming up, or even anthropogenic disturbances such as pollution, or even urban sprawl that we know is happening all across the Great Lakes. So, areas of ecological significance, or for short, I will call them AESs, can translate either to priority action sites or priority management areas, which are terms that are used across the Great Lakes. And these are usually, these areas or action sites are usually identified by the individual lake committees and their task groups. So for example, in Lake Erie, we had the Habitat Task Group identify priority management areas. So one of the goals in the Great Lakes is focusing on protecting and improving water quality and restoring, protecting, and conserving different habitats in the aquatic ecosystem in order to restore or maintain biological diversity. So in Lake Ontario, some of areas like this that are conserved, for example, are Hamilton and Port Harbors. Port Hope harbors and the St. Lawrence River and Niagara River. And you can notice these are generally nearshore areas or river areas as well. In Lake Erie, we have a bit of a mix of river areas, nearshore coastal areas, and offshore areas as well, with pelagic benthic offshore habitats also actually across all three basins being identified as areas of priority management for management. We also have some reefs that are in coastal areas or offshore areas, and we have Detroit River, Sandusky Bay, Buffalo Harbor, just as some examples. So current approach to identifying, I guess, areas of ecological significance or those of higher priority for management, usually we see that they are regionally defined and they are mostly nearshore areas, as I mentioned in Lake Ontario in particular, but not necessarily like in Lake Erie, for example. But generally the way to identify these is via expert opinions or even surveys. And surveys such as trawls, for example, they're conducted seasonally. So generally this way of informing these areas seems to be spatially and temporally biased in terms of the data that is being used. Also, oftentimes, in Lake Erie in particular, those areas are being informed by commercially important species or native species in particular, rather than the biodiversity of the community. This can be a particular drawback that we're not using the biodiversity because this is not necessarily suitable for informing ecosystem resiliency in terms of environmental changes and perturbations as is expected to happen in the future. So there is a little bit of a better approach that we're proposing here, including all areas of the lake, near and offshore areas, would generally generate a little bit more representative picture of the habitat that is of high significance of the entire community and not just the nearshore species, for example. Also, using year-round data that is collected on-site and is continuous across all of the seasons, such as the GLaDOS data, of course, because it's passively collected, receivers are in the water year-round. So it can eliminate spatial and temporal barriers from actually identifying these areas of high priority. Using biodiversity, so using all these commercially important species, but also species that are not necessarily important commercially or recreationally, and also using native and introduced species, because introduced species oftentimes have been already naturalized in the system, and they do have a role to play in the functioning system. This way we can actually understand the significance for the entire fish community. And then finally, using machine learning models, actually, because they rely on environmental conditions and do enable us to hindcast and forecast in the future. So we're grounding essentially the machine learning, not only with the behavior of the fish, but also what is driving these behaviors and distributions of the fish. So quantifying AESs in this particular manner for machine learning, of course, requires accurate knowledge, but we know accurate knowledge is actually required for any way that, no matter how we're actually quantifying any of these areas of ecological significance. So using species distributions and habitat use is one of the ways that we can do this using the GLaDOS data. But we also know that distributions are very highly influenced by biotic and abiotic conditions such as temperature, depth, habitat structure. So we also need data for the environment. And like I said, machine learning modeling also relies on this data as well, which could be useful in a lot of different ways that I will talk about this a little bit later. So GLaDOS actually provides a really good solution for the first one. We talked about species distributions and habitat use because, as I mentioned earlier, provides in situ collection of data that is continuous across seasons and does not rely on, opinions, essentially. So Tom mentioned earlier that fish have been tagged across the Great Lakes since 2010, and there have been, I believe, 29 different species that he mentioned that have been tagged since then. So that provides quite a lot of information that we could use to identify AESs. So in Lake Ontario is the lake that we actually used as a case study. There have been 23 different species that were tagged as of 2020 when we began this project. This included both top and mesopredators, but also some pelagic piscivores and planktivorous fish. And it also included native and naturalized species, so both near and offshore species. So the Ontario food web is actually quite complex, and so 23 different species is probably not enough, given that there's 120 different fish species in the lake and a variety of other organisms. And this is very much the same case for all of the Great Lakes. So we actually used a slightly more simplified version of this. And actually, you can see here the graph of a very simplified Lake Ontario food web that doesn't include all of the species that are involved in this, but it kind of gives you an idea of what's happening. So since we require accurate information, we also needed, in this case, to refine a little bit our definition for what EESs are. So we define these as areas with high biological productivity based on their association and the diversity of fish that use these areas across time and space. So this way we can provide a quantitative and qualitative assessment of the biodiversity patterns. So As you have probably already guessed, our overall aim was to identify fish utilization, biodiversity, areas of ecological significance, and characterize the associated environmental conditions of these areas across two temporal scales, the general one and seasonally. So, as mentioned, GLaDOS obviously is about acoustic telemetry, and I'm going to go very quickly over these methods. So if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me after to clarify some of these. So we use data that's 11 years of data for this across 19 different species. I said there's 23 that were tagged, but we only had 19 that had actually met all the criteria that we were looking for in order to be included in this analysis. So that resulted in 950 different fish. I say here 9.4 million positions for individual positions, but it's actually 35 million detections. And from these, we actually gathered positions, similarly to what Tom was talking about the VPS systems. Next, I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we need is also environmental data, and very good sources for that were GLAF and NOAA for all of the data that we actually were able to pull out from them. So we used physical data for the lake that were static, so things as bathymetric depth, slope, substrate, and then dynamic data that is more climate and biota with temporal component in it. So what that means is that the dynamic data actually changes across space and time. So we used lake surface temperature and chlorophyll A data at the daily scale, and they were derived from satellite. To extract this data, we took the latitude and longitude for each position, for each individual fish, and we went across all of the layers and pulled all that information out across time and space, if time was relevant for that layer. And that resulted in 9.4 million data points with specific environmental information for each of these fish positions. Excuse me. Next, we use species distribution modeling, which is a type of machine learning. And more particularly, we use the maximum entropy model to derive the distribution for 19 different species for each one of them. And because we had 13 different species that were classified as nearshore and 6 only offshore, we didn't want actually to have more bias towards the nearshore areas. We combined near and offshore species together, the distributions, and then we overlapped them so that, and we extracted these areas as our AESs. And then from these areas, we actually pulled out all of the relevant information in terms of what the environment is. So again, this was a very, very quick explanation of these methodologies. If you have any questions, please talk to me after. Just a quick example of the species distribution result. These are for rainbow trout and walleye. And those are just the general results. And for them, we also have seasonal results as well. Jumping into the AES results, this map actually shows the distribution of the AESs across the lake, and you can see that generally they tend to prevail along the western side of the lake. There is some distribution in the Bay of Quinte as well, and closer to Rochester. So they seem to be generally associated with areas of high productivity and inflow from rivers. Furthermore, as I mentioned, we talked about the environmental variables that are quite important when understanding what drives and makes these spots important for fish. So they seem to be associated with about depth of about 22 meters, variation between 15 to 26 meters. So generally, nearshore areas are considered to be about 30 and at 30 meters depth, and offshore areas begin at that from 30 meters and below. So that tells us that they're generally AESs are associated with the deeper nearshore border zone that leads into offshore areas, suggesting that there's a lot of fish that actually seem to use those border areas from both near and offshore. We had a very low reef association, but a lot of sandy and hard substrate type. So sandy seems to be more associated with the offshore areas and seems to be prevalent in those border zones as well. Hard substrate, unfortunately, did not translate to reefs. So that was an interesting finding. And then we had a medium to low relative exposure index, which means generally relative exposure index is the combined influence of waves, wind, and fetch. And so this is the reason why we believe the distribution is more along the western side of the lake rather than the eastern side of the lake. Going into the seasonality, our results were relatively consistent, actually, in terms of where these AESs were located. The only thing we saw is actually that significant shrinkage of the areas in the winter. You can see that they're less than half of all the other seasons. And looking at how the environment was influenced by this, so depth, reef, and exposure index did not really change. The only thing that changed majorly was actually the use of the hard substrate declined significantly in the winter compared to all the other seasons, and the use of southeast flow, areas with southeast bottom flow of the water, which is generally areas that are along between Toronto Harbor and Hamilton Harbor. So this we believe is associated with the ecology of the different species near and offshore. So nearshore species tend to actually move closer inshore in terms of the winter, whereas in the offshore species tend to go more offshore, or actually the nearshore species tend to go into the rivers as well in the winter. So that would be probably why we have a change in the substrates and bottom hydrology. So what does this mean in terms of management, and how do the identification of these areas and these results actually can help in any way? So given that AES we found to be at the deeper border of the nearshore areas, is suggesting that maybe current priority areas or sites of action may not be adequately distributed, or maybe they are, but they're maybe not fully addressing the entire fish community needs. So maybe we need to expand our vision into areas that are slightly offshore that can also address actually fish that are of interest for restoration in the deeper areas, such as bloater, for example, in Lake Ontario. Second, our other result in terms of the consistency across seasons, yes, they are consistent. They seem to be consistent across seasons, more or less, in terms remaining in the same location. But this may change with, for example, climate variation and even anthropogenic disturbances, or like I mentioned earlier, there could be urban sprawl is one of the things that has huge influences on the water around in the lake. So it may be something that may influence future distribution of these areas. And this approach actually that we're using here, that we're using environmental data that also has dynamic components, allows us to actually run scenarios in the future that we can actually predict what would happen across seasons with certain different changes, either climate or otherwise. AESs can be quite useful actually also for habitat management, for example. It will help us identify potentially what habitat may need protection or enhancement, especially if they're frequented by multiples of species or even vulnerable species, or these that are of restoration interest, like I mentioned bloater earlier in Lake Ontario that is currently being reintroduced. Also, population assessments could be informed by these areas. On a quick look, surveys and other troll surveys and whatnot, they seem to be conducted majorly within these same areas that we have identified as AESs. And so they may be biased. So a reevaluation may be needed actually to see if proper representation of these areas is associated with low or high abundances relative to the size of the entire lake, and in order to understand population assessment and how this may influence it. So given I said all this, take this with a grain of salt because there's a few things that we need to consider in terms of pros and cons. So as pros, for example, this method is considered relatively robust because it relies on data that is generated in situ and is from both species and the environment. And this is the reason, again, why we can hindcast and forecast using dynamic environmental data such as temperature and chlorophyll A. Also, another problem would be that it allows us to train actually models from one system and use it in another system for the same species. However, this comes with the con. If population differences exist, they need to be considered in terms of habitat preference from one system to another, or even in the same system if they're different enough in across space and time. So given how big the lakes are, this could be the case here too. So this needs to be taken into consideration. And one way to actually verify this, if you wish, is to include expert opinions, surveys, and fishery data to ground truth some of these results that we're seeing with the machine learning models. So to conclude very quickly, similar data sets for Lake Ontario exist already for Lake Erie and for Lake Huron, and they could be leveraged in a very similar way to actually inform management priorities on habitat, species, and the ecosystem altogether, and could be very useful this way with these novel modeling approaches. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I will take any questions.
Thank you, Silvia. Yeah, we have time for a quick question or two. Not seeing any. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Paul Bzonek is an aquatic science biologist at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Go ahead, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Just take a second here to share my screen. Gonna lose you guys. If you could let me know if you see it.
Yep, you gotta start the slideshow, but we see your,
Yeah.
Looks good.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so today I want to talk to you about a work in progress, which is our Shiny app Heist, which is a tool to visualize telemetry-based fish habitat suitability estimates. And this work was developed at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, specifically the Great Lakes Laboratory for Freshwater and Aquatic Sciences, with myself, John Midwood, and Jake Brownscombe. So as Tom had mentioned, telemetry has entered the age of big data. We have large collaborations between many different groups, and we can do a fantastic job of tracking fish movement beyond, large systems and really get into fine-grained details about where fish are and how they're spending their time. But because we are moving into large groups of information, we've also encountered some new challenges. So, for example, Nguyen et al. In 2017, some time ago, identified that the potential of our telemetry results are limited by the capacity to access and share the enormous data generated, or that we should make efforts to make telemetry findings more accessible through clear and interpretable presentations. And then more recently, work has identified that platforms can be used as a tool to mobilize this information. So identifying the need to maybe create some applications that we could use to reduce the gap in time between the development of studies and the dissemination of this knowledge, as well as just improve the interface between people who would benefit from some of the telemetry and insights that we can generate and those actually conducting the work. So our goal was to provide some of these solutions within department, non-department, to age managers, specifically the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. And they were interested in understanding how specific species and species communities use various habitat features, and they then use that information for a variety of decision-making contexts, such as informing impact mitigations, offsetting, timing windows, and then identifying priority areas. So you might ask, why use telemetry to try to inform habitat use? Because the majority of telemetry studies focus on movements or connectivity, and we're looking at habitat use. But there is certainly a case to be used for using telemetry. With telemetry, we can develop habitat suitability indices. And these are important for valuing fish habitat for protection or remediation, as well as to assess the efficacy of said remediation efforts. So I'll walk us through a case study of how we might do this, and I'll start with Toronto Harbour. So here we have a ongoing telemetry data set, older than 10 years now. We've got 30 million detections, over 400 fish, and we have data from a variety of species, from northern pike to largemouth bass, perch, bowfin, white sucker, and so on. And so within this array, you can see on this map, each of these red dots represents receiver location, and then we can quantify the immediate surrounding environment in those yellow rings and describe the habitat conditions of the receivers as well as the fish that are detected. And we can also assess when and where, what densities, and use this information to assess habitat suitability. So within Toronto Harbour, we had a few habitat layers, including depth, submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, substrate type, and fetch, or exposure. So we can combine both the detection data and our underlying habitat data to get to habitat suitability estimates. And to do this, we have 4 broad steps. The first would be to structure the data. So we take those raw detections, we do our due diligence, the cleaning, the formatting, and we move it to eventually get a species level, presence, absence, per site, per day, for detections that are well filtered in days when we have enough fish that it's not being driven by one individual. And then with this information, we would model the habitat use, where we're fitting the occurrence data to the environmental predictors that we have. And we've been using random forests for a lot of this work. We find out that the classification and regression trees are generally quite robust against non-normal data or nonlinear relationships, and they can handle complex predictor interactions. And then once we have our models, we of course want to validate these models. So we're trying to assess what kind of accuracy these predictive models can then use to forecast fish occurrence on the habitat environments. And this is something that the Bioscome or the Bioenergetics Lab at DFO has been putting quite a bit of time into, a lot of thought into how to best parse out the data into test and training data, and trying to acknowledge the underlying spatial and temporal autocorrelation that you might find. And then finally, once we have our models, we're happy with them, and we validated them, we summarize them using partial dependencies, and we try to produce outputs that might be applicable for management decisions. So we can look at a couple of the partial dependencies for the Toronto Harbour fish and some of the insights that you might gain. Now, this is not going to be new information for a number of the audience here, but you can imagine here, if we look at walleye within Toronto Harbour, we can look at the various traits. So SAV, this is submerged aquatic vegetation, depth, and exposure. This is across all time, and this is broken down by season. We can see, for example, that walleye are strongly associated with low aquatic vegetation in the spring. And this makes sense because this is when they're spending time spawning on that gravel substrate. And though this is known information, you can imagine that this in a more rare species could be informative for DFO for making decisions about habitat protection or impact mitigation and timing. And it can also be useful in additional contexts. So you can look at species compositions and maybe try to extract information on less studied species, make decisions about sampling locations, timing windows, and so on. So this is one example, Toronto Harbor, and we've done similar models for the species available across Stony Lake, Lake Ontario, Lake Winnipeg, Hamilton Harbor, and we're actively trying to add additional water bodies to this species and water body list. So with these outputs, we figured the best way to make them available would be then to put them in a application. And that's where HEIST comes in. HEIST stands for Habitat Evaluation Interactive Suitability Tool. And the name, the five-letter name makes a bit more sense in the context of our DFO teams, where we have a number of 4 or 5-letter apps in development, and I'll get to that later. So I'm going to share a link, a QR code that you can use if you want to take a quick look at the app. But I want to note that this is really a sneak peek. The app is not done. It's still in development. It's in the early testing phase. And so it's not currently being used for decision-making use. And we are just hosting it on a free Shiny app at the moment to kind of give you guys a sneak peek. So if we have a lot of people looking, it might crash, does crash on you, just circle back. It is up and running when we do have lower traffic looking at it. So I'll share this QR code and then I'll have it on the next number of slides. So you can just scan and look at it on your phone if you want, or you could go to qecology-dfo.shinyapps and HEIST. So within our app, we have a general format that follows a home page, and then you can move to individual lakes. Within each lake, we have sub-tabs where you can look at plots of the habitat associations. You can print those out as tables, and then we have an interactive slider, which I'll get into a little bit more detail in the future. So this is our landing page here. You can pick an individual water body, for example, Hamilton Harbor. And then on the left, you can select your target species. By default, it aggregates all the data that we have. You can select families or individual species. And then we've provided outputs across all time, as well as broken down by season for the habitat variables that we had sufficient habitat layers to have. So in this example, that was vegetation, exposure, hardness, Secchi depth, which is cut off, and a few more. So you're able to break into and look at the partial dependencies based on telemetry for these various species, either grouped or individual species. And this was a great start, but our main client of interest, FFHPP, they largely deal with habitat modifications, and they were interested in how habitat importance varies with habitat availability scenarios. So after talking with them, we decided to add, and this is an exploratory tool, kind of just a tool to just eyeball how if you can adjust suitability estimates based on future availability scenarios. And for this, we're just applying a background tan function to the data. So we have a second tab within each water body, and this is our slider tab. So you can pick any feature, this example, exposure level, and then you can increase the percent volume of habitat for a given feature. So for example, I'm going to slide over and pick moderate level of exposure. And then as you change that, it updates the per unit value of adding additional units of that habitat feature, as well as the cumulative value of the habitat feature. In this case, you're looking at low, medium, and high levels of exposure for combined fish species in Hamilton Harbor. And then the third component we added were some of those fantastic maps you just saw from Silviya Ivanova. So we grouped, she had very high temporal and spatial resolution. We brought that down to a bit higher of a spatial grain and grouped it by season. And then we've included outputs so that you can look at those individual species maps that she's generated. So for instance, here we're selecting brown trout, map output, and then you can zoom into specific locations and also select which season you want to look at. This represents a very significant synthesis effort. I mean, Silviya put in a huge amount of work to generate these. So we are looking to expand the number of water bodies we have. We expect we can see some growth in the first tables, but of course these synthesis maps require significant effort. We are happy to grow and expand. Okay, so how might this web tool actually be used? So we'll circle back again to the group we had in mind, which is the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. And their role is to look to conserve existing fish and fish habitat in Canada and administer and ensure compliance for the development projects. And they take power from both the Fisheries Act and the Species at Risk Act. And so they might have a work, in fact, a work or a undertaking or an activity that they expect might affect species or habitat characteristics or affect cumulative effects. And they want to make a decision on whether or not to allow a work to be enacted or what regulations should be affected. They have their own existing toolkit, and they also make use of pathways of effects diagrams. And these pathways of effects are chain diagrams that illustrate what events might take place when an activity goes on. And these have been peer reviewed by scientists with the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat. So we envisioned our app coming in place as they're walking through the pathways of effects diagrams to help inform what those impacts might be, and just be another support as they move from pathways of effects towards final habitat decisions. And these could include letters of advice, regulatory review, and then recommendations for mitigation, offsetting, or restoration. So we can walk through an example. And again, I just want to note that this application has not yet been used for any FFHPP decision making. We're really just in the early testing phase and trying to build it out. So this isn't what has happened, but a way, and we're talking with the groups of how it might be used in their decision-making roles. So one of those pathways of effects is what happens when you have use of machinery in water. You guys can see it. And so a user might walk through it and see, okay, machineries can lead to trampling of aquatic vegetation, which would lead to change or loss of habitat structure. And this is going to either have direct or indirect effects. So if we imagine an example of impact that might impact largemouth bass in, say, Toronto Harbor, we can pull up that water body, look at these outputs, and we can see, okay, this species has a year-round relationship with vegetation. And so this is going to have implications for when you want to recommend timing windows for implementing work or act. Keeping an eye on time here, you can then just walk through the availability slider as well. If you want to think about, maybe an offset that would increase either high or low vegetation. The slide will then help you walk through what the cumulative and poor value impacts of that modification might be. And this would then go back and support those final letters of advice, reg review, mitigation, and so on. Of course, at the moment, we have not just our own Heist app that's in development, but also a broad number of web tools that DFO is supporting to try to help refine some of these decision makings. And so as we're contributing to Heist, we need to be careful to ensure that our tools work well with the others, that each application is distinct and interoperable, and that our designs are built to support the workflows that support regulatory needs. This app, I think, and we hope, is going to be useful, but it is, of course, not perfect. And so as we develop our web tool, we have to navigate compromises between complexity, detail, speed, and usability. So 3 challenges to begin: our data aggregation. As we aggregate this data, we're introducing scaling effects and we're reducing the fidelity of our detections. Of course, we're using multiple water bodies, and so there's limitations in cross-study comparability. If you want to use one of the existing water bodies as a reference, we need to recognize that there's inherent differences in array design, sampling effort, environmental context. And then finally, as we're doing the back-end summary analyses, for now it's been largely classification regression trees, We're generating generalized outputs that are consistent across our water bodies. And because we're generalizing, we may obscure some relevant site-specific effects. These challenges are just inherent in general to trying to produce, reference data across a number of different studies because we are using existing and ongoing projects. And that then brings into question, well, where could this web tool fit in? And we see it as a bridge between general textbooks, your Scott and Crossman, but not quite giving you the resolution you're going to have with those purpose-built and ongoing site-specific publications and studies. But we do hope that we can offer some, greater flexibility to address user interests. So we're growing and we're hoping to continue to grow beyond our current data set. And so if you have habitat data that you think could be beneficial to this, happy to have you reach out and have us join. We're looking to use telemetry data that is well characterized with some environmental data. So we're happy to receive structural data such as substrate and water depth, limnological data, temperature, flow rates, turbidity, and biological data as well. With that, I'd like to thank a large and growing team of collaborators. So within our department, the Fish and Fish Habitat Program, for all the time that they've given, number of collaborators, Sarah Larock, Karen Smokorowski, Doug Watkinson, Lee Katowski, and then of course, Silviya and collaborators at the University of Windsor and the Lotus Group. There's many others. For there, I'll pause. We have some time for questions. Happy to discuss further. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Paul. Great talk. Yeah, any questions for Paul or for Tom or Silviya? If there's no others, I have a quick question. So this is for all the speakers to think about, but GLaDOS has been around for 15 years. I guess, do you have any observations on how the technology has evolved and how it's changed, like the uptake within management and decision making has changed? That's kind of what we're interested in with this webinar series, is how technology moves from sort of experimental development into management and decision making. If you have any observations on that, I'd be really interested.
Sure, I'll jump in first. I mean, I haven't been on the scene for 15 years, but in the few years that I've been involved, I think it's exciting to see an increase in the uptick of these large syntheses projects. I think a lot of these studies started as smaller one-off projects. As we filled in all of the lakes and as we've gone more, we've got really nice, capacity to address fine scale details. And now that we can, address some larger questions, switching from maybe just connectivity questions to habitat use and extracting much more data, I think we're having increased value for management questions.
Thanks, Paul. Couple questions coming in on the chat. So is this an internal tool or is this available to the public? It sounds like HEIST is not quite ready for public consumption yet. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, and it's in its current state, it's not really a tool for either. It's an in testing and development tool. We do want to have it public facing. So most DFO tools are internal, but we do have the option to make it external as well. And we intend to have it be external once it's operable, and we'll send out some advertisements and let people know once it's ready to be fully used. I see a second question as well about looking to keep the data localized to North America. Likely in the near to medium term, speaking with FFHPP, they had a lot of interest in not just lakes, but riverine systems. So our first kind of expansion might be from North American lakes to also expanding to different sampling systems and trying to capture some North American riverine systems. And then if that growth goes well, I mean, I'm certainly happy to bring in some international projects. That sounds very exciting to me. In terms of keeping tractable growth, probably we're going to start with Canadian telemetry data sets.
Thanks. Yeah, and I just for telemetry more generally, GLaDOS is sort of the Great Lakes arm of the Ocean Tracking Network. And so the Ocean Tracking Network has acoustic telemetry tracking all over the world. Any other, we're at time, but any last burning questions for any of our speakers? Well, join me in a big round of applause for Tom and Silviya and Paul. Thank you so much for your presentations and for coming. Thank you all for participating and hope to see you on the next webinar.
Thank you, Julie, and everyone here.
Thank you all.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.